Welcome to True.
Life in London in 1920, Chapter 1. Introduction. London, emerging from the Great War. The year 1920 marked a pivotal moment in London's history. The city stood at the threshold of a new era, barely 18 months removed from the armistice that ended the First World War. The Great War had fundamentally altered the character of the British capital, transforming it from the confident imperial metropolis of the Edwardian Age into a city grappling with loss, change, and an uncertain future. London in 1920 was a city of contrasts and contradictions. It remained the heart of the British Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, controlling roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. The city functioned as the political, economic, and cultural center, not just of Britain, but of this vast global network. Yet beneath this imperial grandeur lay deep wounds. The war had claimed nearly 750,000 British lives, and scarcely a family in London remained untouched by loss. The capital city encompassed approximately 117 square miles and housed over 7 million people within its greater metropolitan area, making it the largest city in Europe and one of the most populous urban centers in the world. The River Thames continued to serve as the city's arterial lifeblood, dividing north from south and serving as a crucial highway for commerce and trade. As Londoners navigated 1920, they found themselves caught between remembrance and renewal. War memorials began appearing across the city's landscape, while simultaneously new construction projects promised modernization and progress. The city echoed with the sounds of demobilized soldiers returning to civilian life, women debating their newly won suffrage rights, and jazz music drifting from nightclubs in the West End. London was rebuilding, reimagining itself, and reluctantly releasing its Victorian moorings to drift towards an uncertain but undeniably modern future. Chapter 2. Political and Administrative Structure. London's political and administrative structure in 1920 remained complex and fragmented, a legacy of centuries of piecemeal development. The governance of the capital was divided among several overlapping authorities, each with distinct responsibilities and jurisdictions. The London County Council, established in 1889, served as the principal administrative body for the inner metropolitan area. The LCC governed an area of approximately 117 square miles, though this represented only the core of what most people considered London. The council comprised 124 councillors, elected from various constituencies across the capital, along with aldermen chosen by the councillors themselves. In 1920, the LCC operated from its impressive headquarters at a county hall on the south bank of the Thames, though the building was still under construction and would not be completed until 1922. The LCC held responsibility for major infrastructure projects, main roads, fire services, parks, housing, and aspects of public health. However, its powers remained limited compared to the 28 metropolitan boroughs that handled local matters such as street cleaning, lighting, and minor roads. These boroughs, including Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, Lambeth, and others, jealously guarded their autonomy and frequently clashed with the LCC over jurisdictional matters. Beyond the LCC's boundaries lay the sprawling suburbs that had grown exponentially in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. These areas fell under various county councils, urban district councils, and rural district councils, creating a bewildering patchwork of local government. Middlesex County Council governed much of northwest London, while parts of Surrey, Kent, Essex, and Hertfordshire contained suburbs that functioned economically and socially as part of London, but administratively belonged to their respective counties. The City of London, the ancient square mile at the capital's historic core, maintained its unique status as a separate entity with its own Lord Mayor, Court of Common Council, and ancient traditions dating back to medieval times. The residential population in the city had dwindled to fewer than 15,000 people. By 1920, it remained Britain's financial heart, and its Lord Mayor wielded considerable ceremonial and practical influence. The political landscape of 1920 London reflected the broader tensions in British society. The Labour Party was gaining strength, particularly in working-class areas of East and South London, challenging the traditional dominance of the Liberal and Conservative parties. The war had accelerated demands for social reform, and municipal politics increasingly focused on housing, healthcare, and workers' rights. Women's suffrage represented another significant political development. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 had granted voting rights to women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications, though full electoral equality with men would not arrive until 1928. Nevertheless, women's increased political participation was already influencing London's political discourse and priorities. The relationship between London's government and the national government at Westminster remained sometimes contentious. The capital's sheer size and importance meant that its administration was a matter of national concern, yet local leaders resented interference from Whitehall. This tension would persist throughout the interwar period and beyond. Chapter 3: Population and Demographics. London's population in 1920 stood at approximately 7.5 million people within the greater metropolitan area, though defining the exact boundaries of London remained problematic. The administrative county of London, governed by the LCC, contained roughly 4.5 million residents, while the suburbs beyond its borders housed an additional 3 million. The city's demographic composition reflected both its long history and recent upheavals. London had always been a magnet for migrants from across Britain and beyond, and this pattern continued in 1920. People from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and England's provincial cities came seeking employment and opportunity. The East End, in particular, housed substantial immigrant communities, including Jews from Eastern Europe who had fled pogroms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, establishing vibrant communities in areas like Whitechapel and Stepney. The war had dramatically impacted London's demographic structure. The loss of nearly 750,000 British men in the conflict meant that women significantly outnumbered men in the population, particularly in the younger age cohorts. This gender imbalance would have profound social and economic consequences throughout the 1920s, as hundreds of thousands of women found themselves without marriage prospects in a society that still largely expected marriage to be a woman's primary role. Age distribution showed the impact of war in other ways. The cohort of men aged 20 to 45 had been decimated, creating a generation gap that affected everything from workforce composition to family structure. Conversely, the birth rate had declined during the war years as families postponed childbearing, though it would temporarily rebound in 1919 and 1920 as demobilized soldiers returned home. Class divisions remained starkly visible in London's population geography. The West End, including areas like Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington, housed the wealthy elite in elegant townhouses and mansion blocks. The middle classes occupied suburbs like Hampstead, Highgate, and areas along the new underground lines in North and Northwest London. The working classes concentrated in inner areas like the East End, Southwark, Bermondsey, and parts of North London, often living in cramped, poorly maintained housing. Poverty remained widespread despite Britain's status as an imperial power. Surveys conducted around this period suggested that approximately 30% of London's population lived at or below the poverty line, struggling to afford adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Malnutrition, particularly among children, remained a serious public health concern in working-class districts. The ethnic composition of London was less diverse than it would later become, but the city was by no means homogeneous. Besides the substantial Jewish community, smaller populations of Chinese people had settled around Limehouse in the East End, working primarily in laundries and restaurants. Indian, African, and Caribbean people, many connected to the maritime trade or the colonial civil service, formed small but significant communities, particularly around dockland areas. Social mobility remained limited but possible. The expansion of white-collar employment, clerical work, and the civil service created opportunities for working-class children who received education to rise into the lower middle class. However, rigid class consciousness pervaded London's society, with accent, dress, occupation, and address serving as immediate markers of social status. Chapter 4: Urban Development and Architecture. London's built environment in 1920 represented layers of history, from medieval fragments in the city to Victorian terraces stretching for miles through inner suburbs to Edwardian garden suburbs on the metropolitan fringe. The war had temporarily halted most major construction projects, but 1920 saw the resumption of building activity as the city contemplated its future development. The City of London remained architecturally dominated by Victorian commercial buildings, though fragments of earlier periods survived, including Christopher Wren's churches rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666. St. Paul's Cathedral continued to dominate the skyline, as planning restrictions prevented buildings from exceeding its height. The Royal Exchange, the Bank of England, and Mansion House represented the architectural grandeur of Britain's financial power. However, many buildings showed neglect from the war years, when maintenance had been deferred and resources diverted to the war effort. The West End showcased London's most prestigious architecture. Nash's Regency terraces around Regent's Park, the grand hotels along Piccadilly, the theatres of Shaftesbury Avenue, and the department stores of Oxford Street created an urban landscape of imperial confidence. Government buildings in Whitehall, including the recently completed Admiralty Arch and the continuing presence of Georgian and Victorian government offices, projected state power and permanence. Residential architecture varied dramatically by class and district. The wealthy inhabited Georgian townhouses in areas like Bloomsbury, Victorian mansion blocks in South Kensington, or detached villas in suburbs like Hampstead. These homes featured multiple stories, substantial rooms, modern plumbing, and electric lighting. Many still employed domestic servants, though the number of servants had declined during the war as women found alternative employment. The middle classes typically occupied terraced houses in suburbs like Clapham, Ealing, or Willesden. These Victorian and Edwardian houses, usually with 3 or 4 bedrooms, a parlor, dining room, and kitchen, represented respectability and comfort. Gardens, both front and rear, were standard features, and most had basic modern amenities, including indoor toilets and gas lighting, with electric lighting gradually spreading. Working-class housing presented a stark contrast. Much of inner London's working-class population lived in Victorian terraced houses subdivided into multiple dwellings, or in purpose-built tenement blocks that varied from decent to deplorable. The East End, in particular, contained extensive areas of poor-quality housing, where multiple families might share a single house, with communal toilets in backyards and no bathrooms. Dampness, poor ventilation, and overcrowding characterized many working-class homes. The wartime experience and the promise of creating a land fit for heroes had generated political pressure for housing reform. The Housing and Town Planning Act of 1919, commonly known as the Addison Act, required local authorities to survey housing needs and develop plans for construction of working-class housing. In 1920, the LCC was beginning to implement schemes for municipal housing estates, though progress remained slow. The council proposed building cottages with gardens on the metropolitan fringe, following garden city principles popularized by Ebenezer Howard. The suburbs continued their inexorable expansion. Developers built thousands of semi-detached houses along the routes of extended underground and railway lines. These suburbs, sometimes called Metroland, in reference to marketing campaigns by the Metropolitan Railway, offered the lower middle class and skilled working class the prospect of home ownership or affordable rents in healthier environments than the congested inner city. Houses featured front and rear gardens, 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and modern conveniences, representing a significant improvement over inner-city living conditions. Architecturally, London in 1920 remained largely Victorian and Edwardian in character. The modernist movement had not yet significantly influenced British architecture, and most new construction followed traditional forms, though simplified and adapted to reduced circumstances and budgets compared to pre-war standards. Red brick remained the dominant building material for ordinary housing, with Portland stone and other prestigious materials reserved for public and commercial buildings. Public buildings under construction or recently completed included County Hall, mentioned earlier, and various war memorials being erected across the city. The Cenotaph in Whitehall, designed by Edwin Lutyens, and initially constructed in temporary materials for the Peace Day celebrations in 1919, was being rebuilt in permanent Portland stone in 1920, providing a focal point for the nation's grief and remembrance. Chapter 5. Transportation and Infrastructure. London's transportation system in 1920 was among the most developed in the world, though strain from deferred wartime maintenance and increasing demand created significant challenges. The network combined traditional and modern forms of transport, from horse-drawn vehicles still common on some streets, to electric underground railways and motor buses. The London Underground, colloquially known as the Tube, formed the backbone of the rapid transit system. By 1920, several lines were operational, including the Metropolitan, District, Piccadilly, Bakerloo, Northern, and Central lines. The system carried millions of passengers annually, enabling people to live in suburbs and commute to work in central areas. Electric traction had replaced steam on most lines, improving the experience for passengers who had previously endured smoke-filled tunnels. Stations featured distinctive design elements that would become iconic, including the rounded Johnston typeface introduced in 1916, and the bullseye symbol, later evolving into the roundel, identifying underground stations. Many stations built in the Edwardian period displayed attractive tilework and architectural details, while newer stations reflected evolving design sensibilities. The Underground's expansion had shaped London's growth, with new lines encouraging suburban development. Property developers and the railway companies worked in concert, with the railways promoting suburban living through extensive marketing campaigns, while developers built housing along the routes. This symbiotic relationship would intensify throughout the 1920s and 1930s. On the surface, motor buses had become the dominant form of public transportation. The London General Omnibus Company, which had pioneered motorization before the war, operated hundreds of distinctive red motor buses across the capital. These replaced the horse-drawn buses that had been ubiquitous in Victorian and Edwardian London. The famous B-type bus, introduced in 1910 and used during the war to transport troops on the Western Front, remained common in 1920, though newer models were being introduced. Trams represented another important form of public transport, particularly in outer boroughs and working-class districts. Electric trams ran on tracks embedded in roads, connecting areas not served by the Underground. The LCC operated an extensive tram network south of the Thames, while various municipal operators ran services north of the river. Trams were cheaper than buses, making them popular with working-class passengers, though they lacked the flexibility of motor buses, and their tracks could obstruct other traffic. Mainline railway stations ringed central London, providing connections to the rest of Britain and serving as termini for suburban services. King's Cross, St. Pancras, Euston, Paddington, Waterloo, Victoria, Charing Cross, and Liverpool Street handled millions of passengers annually. These great Victorian stations, with their magnificent train sheds and elaborate facades, represented the railway age's confidence and ambition. Commuter traffic had grown enormously since the Victorian period, with suburban trains bringing tens of thousands of workers into central London each morning and returning them each evening. Taxis, both motorized and horse-drawn hansom cabs, provided private hire transport. The motor taxi was rapidly displacing the hansom cab, though a few horse-drawn cabs persisted in 1920, romantic relics of a vanishing era. Taxi drivers, required to pass the knowledge, a demanding test of London's streets and locations, maintained standards of professionalism and expertise. Private motor cars remained relatively rare compared to later periods, the province of the wealthy and upper middle class. However, car ownership was growing, and increasing numbers of motor cars competed for road space with buses, trams, horse-drawn vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians. Traffic congestion in central areas was already a serious concern, and the lack of traffic lights or systematic traffic management created chaotic conditions at busy intersections. The Port of London remained one of the world's busiest, handling vast quantities of imports and exports. An extensive system of docks lined the Thames, including the West India Docks, Millwall Docks, Surrey Commercial Docks, and the Royal Docks further downstream. These facilities employed tens of thousands of dockers who loaded and unloaded ships carrying goods from across the British Empire and beyond. The Thames itself remained a working river, with barges and lighters moving cargo between ships and shore facilities, and passenger steamers providing river transport. Roads varied greatly in quality. Main roads in central areas were generally well maintained and paved, often with granite sets or asphalt. However, many side streets and roads in outer areas remained in poor condition, with potholes and inadequate surfacing common. The war had seen road maintenance decline as resources and labor were diverted, and by 1920, significant investment was needed to restore the road network to acceptable standards. Pedestrians navigated streets largely without modern safety measures. Zebra crossings and traffic lights did not yet exist, and pedestrians crossed roads at their own risk. Though some major intersections had police officers directing traffic, the increase in motor vehicles made street crossing increasingly dangerous, and accident rates were rising. Street lighting had transitioned from gas to electricity in many areas, though gas lamps remained common in less affluent districts and would persist in some areas for decades. Electric lighting improved visibility and safety, though many streets remained dimly lit by modern standards. Chapter 6. Housing and Living Conditions. Housing conditions in London 1920 reflected deep class divisions and represented one of the most pressing social issues facing the capital. The war's aftermath and the promise of building a land fit for heroes had raised expectations for housing reform, though actual progress remained frustratingly slow. For the wealthy elite, housing meant spacious townhouses in fashionable districts or large detached villas in affluent suburbs. These homes typically featured multiple floors, numerous bedrooms, reception rooms, dining rooms, libraries, and extensive servant quarters. Despite the declining availability of domestic staff, wealthy households in 1920 still employed cooks, maids, butlers, and other servants, though typically fewer than before the war. These houses had modern plumbing, bathrooms, electric lighting, central heating and telephones, gardens, private garages for motor cars, and elegant furnishings completed the picture of upper-class domestic comfort. The upper middle class inhabited substantial terraced houses or semi-detached villas in respectable districts. These homes, while smaller than those of the wealthy elite, still offered considerable comfort: 4 or 5 bedrooms, separate reception rooms, indoor bathrooms, and modern conveniences. A household might employ 1 or 2 servants, though increasingly, middle-class families managed with daily help rather than live-in staff. These homes reflected respectability and aspiration, with parlors kept for entertaining guests and displaying the family's best furniture and possessions. The lower middle class typically lived in smaller terraced houses or flats in suburbs, or less prestigious inner districts. A typical lower middle class home might have 3 bedrooms, a parlor, dining room, and kitchen. Bathrooms were standard, though shared bathrooms in converted houses were not uncommon. These families rarely employed servants, with housewives managing domestic tasks themselves, perhaps with occasional help for heavy work like laundry. Modern conveniences like gas cookers and, increasingly, electric irons eased domestic labor, though housework remained demanding and time-consuming. Working-class housing varied from barely adequate to appalling. Skilled workers and those in regular employment might rent decent terraced houses or flats in purpose-built blocks. These accommodations typically included 2 or 3 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and outdoor toilet, with shared bathrooms in better developments. Rents consumed a substantial portion of working-class incomes, often 25 to 35% of weekly wages. For the poor and casually employed, housing conditions were often dreadful. Multi-story Victorian houses in areas like the East End, Southwark, and parts of North London had been subdivided into multiple dwellings, with families occupying single rooms and sharing communal facilities. Overcrowding was endemic, with parents and numerous children sharing small spaces. Sanitation was primitive, with outdoor privies serving multiple families and no bathrooms. Water came from shared taps in yards or on landings. Dampness, poor ventilation, and structural decay characterized many working-class dwellings. Landlords, often absentee owners with minimal interest beyond collecting rents, performed little maintenance. Bugs, including bedbugs and fleas, infested poorly maintained properties. Diseases associated with poor housing, including tuberculosis and rickets, claimed thousands of lives annually in working-class districts. The housing shortage had worsened during the war, as construction virtually ceased, while the population continued growing. By 1920, estimates suggested London needed hundreds of thousands of additional dwellings to house the population adequately. The 1919 Housing Act theoretically committed the government to addressing this crisis, but implementation proved slow and complicated. The LCC and metropolitan boroughs began developing municipal housing schemes, representing a revolutionary shift from Victorian laissez-faire attitudes toward state responsibility for housing provision. Early schemes focused on cottage estates on the metropolitan fringe, influenced by Garden City ideals. These developments offered working-class families houses with gardens, indoor outdoor bathrooms, and decent living conditions at subsidized rents. However, these estates often created new problems, as they were distant from employment centers and lacked shops, schools, and social facilities. Transport costs could consume the savings from lower rents, and working-class tenants complained about isolation from traditional communities. Private speculative builders also contributed to housing supply, constructing thousands of semi-detached houses for sale to the lower middle class and skilled working class. The growth of building societies, which provided mortgages, made home ownership increasingly accessible to those who previously could only rent. These suburban houses, while modest by middle-class standards, represented significant improvements over inner-city living conditions and symbolized upward mobility and independence. Homelessness, though less visible than in earlier Victorian periods, remained a serious problem. Common lodging houses provided minimal accommodation for the destitute, offering bed spaces in large dormitories for a few pence per night. These establishments, regulated but often grim, housed a transient population of casual workers, unemployed people, and others on society's margins. Housing reform advocates, social workers, and progressive politicians argued that decent housing was fundamental to social progress, public health, and family stability. They pointed to stark correlations between poor housing and high mortality rates, disease, crime, and social problems. However, implementing reform proved contentious, with debates over public versus private provision, rent controls, and the costs of subsidized housing creating political conflict. Chapter 7. Education System. London's education system in 1920 was in transition, shaped by recent reforms, but still bearing marks of Victorian class divisions. The 1918 Education Act, commonly called the Fisher Act, had raised the school-leaving age to 14 and abolished fees for elementary education, representing significant progress toward universal free education, though implementation faced practical difficulties. Elementary education formed the foundation of working-class children's schooling. Thousands of elementary schools across London, operated by the LCC and various religious organizations, provided basic education for children from roughly age 5 to 14. These schools focused on literacy, numeracy, religious instruction, and practical skills deemed appropriate for working-class children. Classrooms were often large, with 50 or more pupils under a single teacher. Resources were limited, with shortages of textbooks, writing materials, and equipment common in poorer districts. Teaching methods emphasized rote learning, memorization, and discipline. Children learned multiplication tables, spelling, grammar, and religious texts through repetition. Corporal punishment remained standard for enforcing discipline, with teachers authorized to use canes or straps. The curriculum reflected class assumptions about appropriate knowledge for working-class children, emphasizing obedience, punctuality, and preparation for industrial or domestic labor rather than intellectual development. Physical conditions in elementary schools varied widely. Better schools, particularly newer LCC buildings, featured high ceilings, large windows for light and ventilation, and adequate facilities. However, many schools, especially in poorer districts, occupied old buildings that were overcrowded, poorly heated, and lacking basic amenities. Outdoor toilets, inadequate washrooms, and poorly equipped classrooms were common. Medical inspections, introduced earlier in the century, identified widespread health problems among elementary school children, including malnutrition, dental decay, and infectious diseases. Secondary education remained largely the province of the middle and upper classes in 1920, though scholarships enabled a small number of working-class children to access it. Grammar schools, both ancient foundations and more recent establishments, provided academic education for children whose families could afford fees or who won competitive scholarships. These schools offered more extensive curricula, including classics, modern languages, sciences, mathematics, history, and geography, preparing students for university or professional careers. Private schools, ranging from modest establishments to prestigious public schools, served the upper and upper middle classes. Institutions like Westminster School, St. Paul's School, and numerous others provided elite education emphasizing classics, character formation, and preparation for leadership roles. Many of these schools had strong ties to Oxford and Cambridge universities. Girls' education at this level focused heavily on accomplishments deemed suitable for young ladies, though academic standards were gradually rising. The gender divide in education remained pronounced. While elementary education was coeducational, secondary education largely segregated boys and girls. Boys' schools emphasized preparation for professional or business careers, while girls' schools, even academic ones, included substantial domestic science instruction alongside academic subjects. The assumption that most girls would become wives and mothers fundamentally shaped their educational experience. Universities represented the apex of educational opportunity, accessible to only a tiny fraction of the population. The University of London, a federal institution including colleges like University College London, King's College London, and others, provided higher education in the capital. However, university education remained overwhelmingly middle and upper class, with working-class students extremely rare. Women's access to higher education had expanded significantly since the late Victorian period, though female students still faced discrimination and restrictions. Technical and vocational education was developing, recognizing that industrial economy required trained workers. Polytechnics, evening classes, and technical institutes provided training in trades, commercial skills, and applied sciences. The London County Council operated numerous technical institutes and evening institutes where working people could improve their skills and knowledge. These institutions played important roles in enabling working-class students to improve their employment prospects. Teacher training occurred in specialized training colleges, with elementary teachers receiving 2 years of training and secondary teachers typically being university graduates. Teaching was one of few professional careers accessible to women, though female teachers faced mandatory resignation upon marriage in most authorities, reflecting assumptions about women's proper sphere. Educational reformers in 1920 advocated for greater equality of opportunity, improved school conditions, and expanded secondary education. They argued that national prosperity and social progress required developing the potential of all children, not just those from privileged backgrounds. However, implementing such reforms required substantial resources and challenged deeply entrenched class attitudes about education's purposes. School attendance had improved significantly with compulsory education laws, though truancy remained a problem, particularly in poor areas where children's earnings contributed to family survival. Attendance officers worked to enforce school attendance, though poverty, illness, and family circumstances created ongoing challenges. Adult education opportunities existed through evening classes, Workers' Educational Association courses, and public lectures. Libraries, while not yet universal, provided important resources for self-education. The belief in self-improvement through education remained strong among working-class communities, with autodidacts achieving remarkable educational accomplishments despite limited formal opportunities. Chapter 8. Economy and Employment. London's economy in 1920 was experiencing turbulent transition from wartime production to peacetime operation. The demobilization of millions of servicemen created immense pressures on the labor market, while industries adjusted from war production to civilian goods. The economy faced inflation, labor unrest, and uncertainty about future direction. The service sector remained London's economic heart, distinguishing it from Britain's industrial cities. Finance, commerce, government administration, professions, and retail trade employed hundreds of thousands of Londoners. The City of London functioned as the world's financial center, with banks, insurance companies, commodity exchanges, and shipping firms conducting global business. The Bank of England, merchant banks, insurance underwriters at Lloyd's, and the Stock Exchange formed pillars of British and international finance. Government employment was substantial and growing. The expansion of state functions during the war had swelled civil service ranks, and many wartime functions continued in peacetime. Whitehall's ministries and departments employed thousands of clerks, administrators, and officials. Local government through the LCC and metropolitan boroughs also employed significant numbers in administration, education, public health, and municipal services. Retail trade employed large numbers, particularly women. Department stores on Oxford Street, Regent Street, and Kensington High Street employed thousands of shop assistants, display staff, and supervisors. Smaller shops throughout London's neighborhoods provided grocery, butchery, bakery, drapery, and countless other goods and services. Markets, including famous ones like Covent Garden for produce and Billingsgate for fish, were major employers and commercial centers. Professional employment included lawyers, doctors, architects, accountants, and engineers. The legal profession concentrated around the Inns of Court and the law courts in the Strand. Medical professionals staffed London's numerous hospitals, clinics, and private practices. These professions remained largely middle and upper class preserves, requiring expensive education and training. Manufacturing, while less dominant than in northern industrial cities, remained important in London. Engineering firms, particularly in areas like Woolwich and along the Thames, produced machinery, vehicles, and equipment. The printing and publishing industries concentrated around Fleet Street employed thousands in producing newspapers, books, and periodicals. Clothing manufacture, much of it sweated labor in East End workshops, produced garments for domestic and export markets. Food processing, brewing, furniture making, and countless other industries operated across the capital. The docks employed tens of thousands in one of London's most important but precarious occupations. Dockers loaded and unloaded ships, sorted cargo, and moved goods through the port. Much dock labor was casual, with men gathering at dock gates each morning hoping to be selected for work. This system created insecurity and poverty despite the dock's economic importance. Dock labor had a militant tradition, with unions like the Transport and General Workers Union organizing workers and occasionally striking for better conditions. Construction was expanding after wartime dormancy, employing builders, craftsmen, and laborers. The housing construction programs and commercial development created demand for skilled tradesmen including bricklayers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and painters, as well as unskilled laborers. Women's employment had expanded dramatically during the war as they replaced men in factories, offices, and transport. However, 1920 saw pressure for women to withdraw from employment to make way for returning servicemen. Many women resented being forced from jobs they had performed competently, but social pressure and explicit policies pushed them toward traditional female employment in domestic service, textile work, teaching, and nursing, or toward leaving paid employment entirely. Domestic service remained the largest single employer of women despite wartime changes. Middle and upper-class households employed servants. Though fewer than before the war, servants faced long hours, low pay, and limited freedom, though positions in good households provided security and respectability. The declining appeal of domestic service created perpetual complaints from employers about the servant problem. Unemployment emerged as a serious concern in 1920 as the brief post-war boom began fading. Demobilized servicemen struggled to find work, particularly unskilled men whose labor was less in demand in peacetime. The government's out-of-work donation scheme provided temporary relief, but its expiration would create hardship. Trade unions, strengthened during the war, agitated for better conditions and resisted wage cuts, leading to numerous strikes and labor disputes. Wages varied enormously by occupation, skill, and gender. Skilled tradesmen might earn £3 to £5 weekly, providing modest comfort for their families. Clerks and shop assistants earned similar amounts. Unskilled laborers earned substantially less, perhaps 30 to 40 shillings weekly, barely sufficient for subsistence. Women earned considerably less than men for equivalent work, typically half to two-thirds of male wages. Professional salaries varied widely, but generally provided comfortable middle-class incomes. Working conditions ranged from reasonable to appalling. Professional and clerical workers enjoyed relatively comfortable environments, though office equipment was primitive by later standards. Factory workers faced noise, danger, and uncomfortable conditions, though factory acts provided some protections. Sweated trades, particularly in garment making, involved long hours and poor conditions for minimal pay. The 8-hour day remained an aspiration rather than universal reality, with many workers laboring 9, 10, or more hours daily. Trade unions had grown significantly in strength and membership during and immediately after the war. The Trades Union Congress represented organized labor nationally, while individual unions represented specific trades and industries. Union membership among skilled workers was high, though unskilled, and white-collar workers were less organized. Unions negotiated with employers over wages and conditions, and organized strikes when negotiations failed. The immediate post-war period saw significant labor militancy, with workers seeking to preserve wartime gains and improve conditions. Chapter 9. Trade, Export, and Import. London's role as an imperial and international trading center defined much of its economic identity in 1920. The Port of London handled vast quantities of goods moving between Britain and the rest of the world, while the city's financial and commercial institutions facilitated global trade through credit, insurance, and commodity markets. The British Empire remained the foundation of London's trading networks. Raw materials flowed from colonies and dominions to British ports, with London receiving substantial shares. Wool from Australia and New Zealand, cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, tea from India and Ceylon, coffee from East Africa, cocoa from West Africa, grain from Canada and Australia, and countless other commodities passed through London's docks. These raw materials fed British industry or were re-exported to other destinations. British manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction, with the empire providing markets for British textiles, machinery, metal goods, chemicals, and consumer products. This imperial trade network, while beneficial for British commerce, reflected unequal economic relationships that would eventually generate criticism and resentment in colonized territories. Trade with Europe remained important despite wartime disruption. Britain imported food products, wines, timber, and manufactured goods from European nations while exporting coal, machinery, textiles, and other products. The recent war complicated European trade relations, with former enemies like Germany facing restrictions and reparations, while relationships with former allies required rebuilding. Transatlantic trade with the United States had grown enormously. America had emerged from the war as an economic powerhouse and Britain's creditor rather than debtor. British imports from America included cotton, tobacco, wheat, machinery, and increasingly manufactured goods and luxury items. American cultural products, including films and music, were beginning to influence British tastes. British exports to America included textiles, machinery, chemicals, and luxury goods, though Britain faced growing competition from American domestic production. Trade with Latin America, Asia, and Africa involved both direct colonial relationships and independent trading partners. British merchants and shipping lines had established extensive networks across these regions, facilitating flows of raw materials, agricultural products, and manufactured goods. London's commodity exchanges traded products from these regions, with prices set in London markets, affecting producers worldwide. The physical infrastructure of trade centered on the docks. The Port of London Authority, established in 1909, managed the docks and river. Ships from around the world berthed at London's docks, where armies of dockers unloaded cargoes. Warehouses stored goods awaiting distribution, with some commodities, particularly valuable ones, like tea, coffee, and spices, stored in bonded warehouses until customs duties were paid. Customs and excise duties provided substantial government revenue while protecting British industries from foreign competition. Tariffs on imports varied by product, with free trade traditions limiting protectionism compared to some other nations, though wartime expedients and post-war economic pressures generated debates about tariff policy. Insurance and shipping were crucial to London's trading role. Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market, underwrote marine insurance for ships, and Creatries Continuargos worldwide, spreading risk and enabling global commerce. British shipping lines, including famous companies like Cunard, P&O, and numerous others, operated vast fleets of merchant vessels connecting British ports to the world. London shipping firms managed vessels, arranged cargoes, and coordinated complex logistics of international trade. The Baltic Exchange facilitated shipping contracts and freight arrangements, bringing together shipowners and merchants needing to transport goods. Commodity markets traded products like grain, sugar, metals, rubber, and other materials, with traders buying and selling futures contracts based on anticipated supply and demand. These markets provided price discovery mechanisms that influenced global commodity prices and enabled merchants to hedge against price fluctuations. Banking services were fundamental to international trade. Merchant banks like Rothschild's, Barings, and others provided letters of credit, trade finance, and foreign exchange services enabling international transactions. British banks had branches and correspondent relationships worldwide, facilitating payment transfers and currency exchanges. The pound sterling remained the primary currency for international trade settlement, with London's financial markets determining exchange rates. Exports from London and Britain more broadly faced challenging circumstances in 1920. British industries had lost market share during the war, as other nations developed their own manufacturing capabilities or sourced goods from neutral countries or the United States. British textile exports, once dominant globally, faced intense competition from Japanese, American, and Indian producers. Coal exports remained significant, but faced growing competition. Machinery and engineering products represented important export sectors, with British firms enjoying reputations for quality and reliability. Imports satisfied Britain's enormous appetite for food and raw materials. Britain's dense population and industrial economy far exceeded domestic agricultural capacity, making food imports essential. Wheat from North America and Australia, meat from Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand, dairy products from Denmark and the Dominions, sugar from the West Indies and other tropical regions, tea from India and Ceylon, and coffee from various sources fed Britain's population. Industrial raw materials, including cotton, wool, rubber, metals, and timber, arrived continuously to supply British factories. The visible trade balance exports minus imports typically showed deficits, with imports exceeding exports in value. However, Britain balanced these deficits through invisible earnings from shipping services, insurance, financial services, and investment income from overseas assets. London's role as a global financial center generated enormous earnings that offset merchandise trade deficits and sustained Britain's international financial position. Re-export trade involved importing goods and then exporting them, often after processing or sorting. London merchants imported raw materials, or semi-finished goods, added value through processing, grading, or packaging, and then exported them to final destinations. This entrepot trade had been important historically and continued to contribute to London's commercial economy. Trade documentation and customs procedures required substantial clerical labor. Shipping documents, bills of lading, customs declarations, invoices, and insurance certificates documented every transaction. Counting houses employed clerks who maintained meticulous records of shipments, payments, and inventories. The administrative infrastructure supporting physical trade employed thousands in offices around the city and docklands. Quality control and commodity inspection services operated in connection with major trades. Tea tasters sampled and graded teas arriving from India and Ceylon. Wine merchants assessed wines arriving from France and other producing regions. Grain inspectors examined wheat and other cereals. Rubber brokers assessed rubber shipments. These specialists' expertise ensured quality and enabled price differentiation based on characteristics. Trade associations and commercial organizations represented various industries' interests. The Chamber of Commerce advocated for merchants' concerns. Specific commodity associations represented traders in particular products. These organizations lobbied government on tariff policies, regulations, and international trade agreements, organized industry events, and provided forums for commercial networking. The immediate post-war period created particular challenges and opportunities for trade. European markets were disrupted by war damage and economic dislocation. New nations emerging from the collapsed empires of Central and Eastern Europe created new trading relationships and uncertainties. Currency instabilities complicated international transactions. However, post-war reconstruction generated demand for British exports, particularly capital goods, machinery, and industrial equipment. Imperial preference, the idea of preferential tariff treatment among empire nations, gained political support from those who envisioned the empire as an integrated economic bloc. However, implementing such policies proved controversial, with free traders opposing protectionism and dominions wanting to develop their own industries, rather than remaining dependent on British manufacturers. Smuggling and customs evasion represented persistent problems, with valuable commodities like spirits, tobacco, and luxury goods targets for illicit trade avoiding duties. Customs officials worked to detect and prevent smuggling, though the volume of trade and limitations of enforcement meant some evasion inevitably occurred. Labor relations and trade-related industries created tensions. Dockers, seafarers, and transport workers had strong unions that struck for better wages and conditions. Disruptions to trade through strikes damaged Britain's reputation as a reliable trading partner and generated conflicts between labor, employers, and government. Chapter 10, Industry and Manufacturing. London's industrial character in 1920 differed significantly from Britain's northern and Midland manufacturing centres. While Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and other cities specialized in heavy industry and mass production, London's manufacturing remained relatively diverse, smaller scale, and focused on skilled trades, finishing processes, and products requiring proximity to markets and labor. Engineering represented one of London's most important industrial sectors. Firms along the Thames, particularly in areas like Woolwich, Greenwich, and further downstream, manufactured machinery, vehicles, and equipment. The Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, though reducing production from wartime peaks, remained a major employer producing armaments and military equipment. Private engineering firms manufactured everything from precision instruments to large industrial machinery, employing skilled metalworkers, fitters, turners, and other tradesmen. Vehicle manufacturing was developing, with several firms producing motor cars, commercial vehicles, and motorcycles. While Britain's motor industry was smaller than America's mass production giants, British firms like Rolls-Royce developed reputations for quality engineering. Many vehicle manufacturers concentrated on luxury models or specialized commercial vehicles rather than mass-market automobiles. Skilled craftsmen hand-built components and assembled vehicles in workshops rather than assembly lines, reflecting British manufacturing traditions, emphasizing craft skills over American mass production methods. Electrical engineering and equipment manufacturing were growing industries. Firms produced electrical motors, generators, lighting equipment, cables, and increasingly, consumer electrical goods. The electrification of homes and industries created expanding markets for electrical products. British firms competed with American and German competitors in this sector, with varying success in different product categories. The clothing industry employed tens of thousands, particularly in the East End. This sector encompassed everything from bespoke tailoring in Savile Row, producing expensive suits for wealthy clients, to sweated labor in cramped workshops making ready-made clothing for mass markets. The contrast between these extremes epitomized London's industrial divisions. Skilled tailors, cutters, and seamstresses earned decent wages producing quality garments. Conversely, sweated labor in clothing workshops involved long hours, piecework payment, and minimal earnings, often in workers' homes, or small workshops with multiple families working together. Boot and shoemaking, both bespoke and mass-produced, employed substantial numbers. Leather workers, cobblers, and factory hands produced footwear, ranging from expensive bespoke shoes for wealthy customers to cheap boots for working-class buyers. The trade involved both traditional craft skills and emerging factory production methods. Food processing industries served London's enormous population. Breweries produced beer, with famous names like Whitbread, Courage, and Truman operating large facilities. Distilleries made spirits, particularly gin, historically important in London. Biscuit factories, confectionery works, flour mills, and countless other food processing establishments prepared products for local and national consumption. These industries required both skilled workers and unskilled laborers performing repetitive tasks. Printing and publishing concentrated around Fleet Street and surrounding areas. Newspapers, books, magazines, and commercial printing employed compositors, printers, bookbinders, and related trades. This sector required literacy and specialized skills, making it a prestigious working-class occupation. The print unions were strong and protected members' interests vigorously. Printing technology was evolving, with mechanical typesetting and faster printing presses increasing productivity, though traditional craft skills remained essential. Furniture making, particularly in areas like Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, employed skilled cabinet makers, upholsterers, and woodworkers. This trade produced everything from expensive bespoke furniture for wealthy clients to cheaper mass-produced items. Craft traditions remained strong, with apprenticeship systems transmitting skills across generations. Chemical industries produced pharmaceuticals, dyes, cleaning products, and industrial chemicals. British chemical firms had expanded during the war when access to German chemicals was cut off, though post-war German competition threatened British producers. Chemical manufacturing required both scientific knowledge and skilled workers handling dangerous materials. Precision instrument making, including scientific instruments, optical equipment, and watches, employed highly skilled craftsmen. British firms enjoyed strong reputations for quality in these specialized sectors, serving scientific, medical, military, and commercial markets. These industries required years of training and exceptional manual dexterity and precision. Pottery and ceramics industries, though more concentrated outside London, maintained presence in the capital. Producers made everything from fine china for wealthy customers to common earthenware for everyday use. Decorative skills and craft knowledge were crucial in this sector. Rubber goods manufacturing utilized imported rubber to produce tires, footwear, industrial goods, and countless other products. This industry had grown with automobile development and industrial applications of rubber products. Metalworking trades included foundries, brassworking, tinsmithing, and related occupations. These trades produced everything from small hardware items to large metal structures, employing skilled workers in physically demanding conditions. Foundry work, involving molten metal in hot, dangerous environments, was particularly arduous, but essential for producing metal castings. Small-scale manufacturing pervaded London's industrial landscape. Countless small workshops, employing a handful of workers, produced specialized products, leather goods, jewelry, scientific instruments, musical instruments, surgical instruments, and endless other items. These businesses often operated from premises that were simultaneously workshops and residences, with families living above or behind their workplaces. Industrial conditions varied enormously. Modern factories, particularly newer establishments, provided relatively good conditions, with adequate lighting, ventilation, and safety measures. However, many workplaces, especially smaller workshops and older facilities, were poorly lit, inadequately ventilated, and dangerous. Industrial accidents were common, with machinery lacking safety guards, and workers having little protection from hazards. Factory inspectors enforced regulations, though their numbers were inadequate for comprehensive oversight. Child labor in industry had largely disappeared following Victorian reforms, raising minimum working ages, though young teenagers still entered employment in many industries. Apprenticeship systems in skilled trades typically began around age 14, with youths learning trades through years of practical experience under skilled workers' supervision. Industrial relations reflected broader social tensions. Skilled workers organized in craft unions protected their interests and maintained wage differentials over unskilled labor. Employers resisted union demands and sought to control production processes. Strikes occurred regularly as workers and employers contested wages, conditions, and work organization. The government occasionally intervened in major disputes affecting essential industries or threatening public order. Technology transfer from America and Germany influenced British manufacturing. American mass production techniques attracted interest, though British manufacturers remained committed to craft traditions and skeptical of standardization. Scientific management theories promoted by Americans like Frederick Taylor generated debate about production organization and worker control. Female industrial labor had expanded during wartime, but contracted afterward as women were pressured from manufacturing employment. Those remaining in industrial work typically performed lower-paid, less skilled tasks, though some skilled positions in clothing, food processing, and other industries employed women. Gender wage differentials remained pronounced, with women earning substantially less than men, regardless of skill or task. Industrial pollution represented serious environmental and health problems, though contemporaries understood these issues less comprehensively than later generations. Factories emitted smoke, chemicals, and waste into the air and Thames. Working-class neighborhoods near industrial areas suffered worst pollution impacts, contributing to respiratory diseases and reduced life expectancy. Chapter 11. Banking and Finance. London's position as the world's financial center represented perhaps its most distinctive characteristic in 1920. The City of London, that historic square mile, functioned as the control center for global finance, with institutions and practices developed over centuries, facilitating international capital flows, trade finance, and investment. The Bank of England stood at the apex of British finance, serving as the government's bank, the note-issuing authority, and the banking system's ultimate guarantor. Located on Threadneedle Street in imposing buildings reflecting Britain's financial power, the bank enjoyed enormous prestige and influence. Though technically a private institution until its later nationalization, it worked closely with government and exercised quasi-governmental functions. The bank controlled monetary policy, managed gold reserves, and intervened in financial markets to maintain stability. Merchant banks represented another pillar of London's financial system. These private partnerships, including famous names like Rothschilds, Barings, Schroders, and Hambros, specialized in international finance, trade financing, and investment banking. They arranged loans for governments, financed international trade through letters of credit, underwrote securities issues, and advised wealthy clients on investments. Many merchant banks had continental European origins, reflecting London's cosmopolitan financial character. Commercial banks served business and private customers with deposit accounts, loans, and payment services. The Big Five clearing banks, Barclays, Lloyds, Midland, National Provincial, and Westminster, dominated retail and commercial banking through extensive branch networks. These banks had grown through mergers and acquisitions in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, concentrating British banking in fewer, larger institutions. Their branches throughout London and nationwide collected deposits from the public and provided credit to businesses and individuals. The stock exchange in Threadneedle Street facilitated trading in securities, including government bonds, consols, corporate stocks, colonial and foreign government bonds, and railway securities. Stockbrokers and jobbers, market makers, conducted trading on the exchange floor in organized but chaotic scenes of shouting and hand signaling. The exchange provided crucial functions of price discovery and liquidity, enabling investors to buy and sell securities. British government debt, accumulated especially during the war, represented huge amounts of securities requiring active markets for trading. Lloyds of London, located in the Royal Exchange Building, operated its unique insurance market. Lloyds wasn't itself an insurance company, but rather a market where individual underwriters and syndicates accepted insurance risks. Lloyds specialized in marine insurance, but also underwrote various other insurance types. Its reputation for paying claims and expertise in assessing risks made it crucial to international trade and commerce. Foreign exchange markets in London determined currency values and facilitated international transactions. The pound sterling's role as the world's primary reserve currency and trade settlement medium made London's foreign exchange market globally significant. Currency dealers bought and sold pounds, dollars, francs, marks, and other currencies, profiting from spreads and enabling international commerce. Commodity markets traded various products essential to British industry and commerce. The Baltic Exchange handled shipping and freight contracts. Metal exchanges traded copper, tin, zinc, and other metals. Produce exchanges dealt in grain, sugar, rubber, and other commodities. These markets brought together buyers and sellers globally, establishing prices and facilitating hedging against price fluctuations. Gold remained central to the international monetary system, despite wartime disruptions. The pound had historically been convertible to gold at a fixed rate, and restoring this gold standard represented a major policy objective. London's gold market and the Bank of England's gold reserves positioned London as a key node in international gold flows. The tension between maintaining gold convertibility and domestic economic concerns would generate significant policy debates throughout the 1920s. Accounting and auditing firms supported London's financial activities. Firms that would later become the major international accounting partnerships were already established, providing auditing, tax advice, and business consulting services. Chartered accountants enjoyed professional status and played important roles in corporate governance and financial reporting. Legal services supported financial transactions. Solicitors in the city specialized in banking law, securities regulations, corporate law, and commercial contracts. The complexity of international finance and British commercial law required sophisticated legal expertise. The law courts and legal chambers in nearby areas served the city's legal needs. Insurance companies, beyond Lloyds, operated throughout the city. Life insurance, fire insurance, and various other insurance types provided risk management for individuals and businesses. British insurance companies had extensive overseas operations, earning premiums from empire and beyond. Insurance investments also channeled British capital into securities and property, making insurance companies significant investors. Trust companies and investment trusts pooled investors' money to purchase diversified securities portfolios, offering smaller investors access to diversified investment opportunities. These early forms of mutual funds attracted middle-class investors seeking investment returns without directly managing securities portfolios. Discount houses were specialized institutions that discounted commercial bills, essentially short-term IOUs businesses used for credit. These institutions provided liquidity to the money market and connected the Bank of England's monetary policy to commercial credit markets. Financial regulation remained light by later standards, with market practices and professional norms providing much oversight. The stock exchange was self-regulating, with its own rules and disciplinary procedures. Bank regulation was minimal, based on assumptions that sound management and reputational concerns would prevent excessive risk-taking. The war and its financial disruptions had generated some new regulations, but the philosophy remained generally laissez-faire. The war had significantly affected London's financial position. Britain had liquidated substantial overseas investments to finance the war effort and had borrowed heavily from the United States. From being the world's largest creditor nation, Britain emerged from the war with substantial debts. Nevertheless, London's financial infrastructure, expertise, and networks remained intact, and the city worked to restore its pre-war financial dominance. International lending was resuming after wartime disruption. British investors and institutions sought opportunities in empire development, European reconstruction, and emerging markets. However, domestic investment needs and war debt servicing competed with overseas lending. The question of capital export controls versus free capital movement generated policy debates. Financial employment offered respectable careers for middle-class men. Banks, insurance companies, stockbrokers, and other financial institutions employed thousands of clerks, accountants, and managers. These white-collar positions provided steady incomes and social respectability, though they required education and typically involved years of advancement through organizational hierarchies. Women's employment in finance was increasing gradually, primarily in clerical positions, though barriers to advancement remained formidable. The city's unique culture combined ancient traditions with modern commerce. Institutions maintained ceremonial aspects and conservative dress codes while conducting cutting-edge financial transactions. The Lord Mayor of London, elected annually, combined ceremonial duties with commercial promotion. City livery companies, medieval guilds that had evolved into charitable and social organizations, maintained presence and influence. Financial scandals and failures periodically disrupted markets, though the period around 1920 was relatively stable. The memory of Victorian financial panics and bank failures encouraged caution, while recent wartime cooperation between finance and government created new relationships and expectations. Chapter 12: Social Life and Entertainment. Social life and entertainment in London 1920 reflected the city's diversity, with activities and amusements varying dramatically by class, age, and gender. The post-war mood combined relief at peace, grief over losses, and eagerness to embrace new experiences after years of wartime restrictions. West End theatres represented London's most prestigious entertainment venues. Playhouses on Shaftesbury Avenue and surrounding streets presented everything from serious drama to light comedies and musicals. The theater season brought middle and upper-class audiences to evening performances, with formal dress expected for opening nights and premium seats. Productions featured leading actors and actresses of the day, with performances generating critical commentary in newspapers and magazines. Theater attendance signified cultural sophistication and social status. Music halls and variety theaters provided more populist entertainment. These venues, scattered throughout London, presented mixed programs of comedians, singers, dancers, acrobats, and other variety acts. Music halls appealed primarily to working and lower middle-class audiences seeking affordable entertainment. The atmosphere was informal, with audiences eating, drinking, and responding vocally to performers. Famous music hall performers enjoyed celebrity status, particularly among working-class fans. Cinema was rapidly becoming the dominant mass entertainment medium. Picture palaces, purpose-built cinemas ranging from modest neighborhood establishments to elaborate theaters in central areas, showed silent films to audiences of all classes. American films dominated programming, with stars like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks achieving global celebrity. British film production existed, but struggled to compete with Hollywood's output and production values. Cinema tickets were affordable even for working-class families, making movies genuinely democratic entertainment. Programs typically included a feature film, newsreels, and short comedies or travelogues. Dance halls and nightclubs were emerging as social spaces, particularly for young people. Jazz music, imported from America, was becoming fashionable, particularly among the young and wealthy. Nightclubs in the West End attracted fashionable crowds dancing to jazz bands, drinking cocktails, and embracing modern behavior that scandalized older generations. Dance halls in working-class areas provided similar entertainment at lower prices, though with less social cachet. Pubs remained crucial social institutions, particularly for working-class men. Tens of thousands of public houses across London served beer and spirits, providing social spaces for conversation, games like darts and dominoes, and community gathering. Pub culture remained largely male-dominated, though women's presence was increasing gradually. Licensing laws, tightened during wartime, continued to restrict opening hours, with pubs closing in the afternoon and early evening. Restaurants and dining establishments varied from expensive establishments serving wealthy patrons to modest cafes and chop houses serving working people. West End restaurants offered fashionable dining, with continental cuisine particularly prestigious. Tea rooms provided respectable spaces where middle-class women could socialize. Working-class dining options included pie shops, eel and mash houses, and street vendors selling food. Sport attracted passionate followings. Football, soccer, was the dominant working-class spectator sport, with professional clubs throughout London drawing large crowds to weekend matches. Arsenal, Tottenham Hotspur, Chelsea, West Ham United, and other clubs had loyal followings. Matches provided social occasions where working-class men gathered to support their teams, creating community identities and rivalries. Cricket, though following summer schedules, was also popular, with test matches at Lord's and the Oval attracting crowds. Rugby, boxing, and horse racing had significant followings. Parks and open spaces provided free recreation opportunities. London's parks, including Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Victoria Park, and numerous others, offered spaces for walking, sports, and relaxation. Working-class families used parks for Sunday outings, with children playing while adults socialized. Bandstands featured free concerts. Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park provided forums for public speaking and political debate. Museums and galleries offered cultural enrichment. The British Museum, National Gallery, Victoria and Albert Museum, Natural History Museum, and others provided free admission to extensive collections. These institutions attracted both educated middle-class visitors seeking cultural improvement and working-class people pursuing self-education. Lending libraries, though not yet universally available, provided reading material for those seeking knowledge or entertainment through books. Reading remained important entertainment and education. Newspapers, both daily papers and weekly publications, enjoyed wide circulation. The Times, Daily Mail, Daily Express, and other national papers competed for readers, while local papers covered neighborhood news. Magazines catering to various interests proliferated, including women's magazines, boys' adventure papers, literary journals, and hobby publications. Public libraries and commercial lending libraries made books accessible. Church and chapel activities provided social opportunities, particularly for working and lower middle-class people. Religious observance was declining from Victorian levels, but remained significant. Churches organized social events, clubs, and charitable activities providing community gathering spaces beyond religious services. The Salvation Army and other religious organizations operated social programs including shelters, soup kitchens, and recreational activities. Working men's clubs offered social facilities for members, typically centered on drinking, but also including games, reading rooms, and social events. These clubs, often affiliated with labor movement or cooperative societies, provided alternative social spaces to commercial pubs. Gambling, though heavily restricted, remained popular. Betting on horse races through illegal bookmakers was widespread among working-class men. Football pools were emerging, offering chances to win prizes by predicting match results. Gambling's illegal status created interactions with police and criminal justice system that working-class communities often resented. Seaside excursions represented special occasions, particularly for working-class families. Railway companies organized day trips to coastal resorts like Southend, Brighton, and Margate, offering escape from London's crowded streets. These trips, especially during bank holidays, brought thousands of Londoners to beaches for fresh air and amusement park entertainment. Social clubs and societies organized around shared interests proliferated. Hobby groups, literary societies, political organizations, trade union branches, and countless other associations provided opportunities for socializing around common interests. These voluntary associations represented important features of civil society, bringing people together and creating networks beyond family and workplace. Gender segregation remained pronounced in social life. Many activities, particularly sports and pub culture, were male-dominated. Women's social opportunities centered more on church activities, shopping, and visiting among friends and family. However, younger women in 1920 were increasingly claiming public spaces and mixed-gender entertainment venues, challenging Victorian propriety. The flapper, the archetypal young woman of the 1920s embracing modern behaviors and fashions, was beginning to emerge, though full flowering would come later in the decade. Class divisions shaped entertainment choices and accessibility. Upper-class social life involved private clubs, country house weekends, fashionable restaurants, and exclusive events. Middle-class entertainment emphasized respectability and cultural improvement alongside pleasure. Working-class entertainment was often more boisterous and less formal, though respectability remained important for those aspiring to better themselves. Chapter 13: Fashion and Daily Life. Daily life in London, 1920, varied dramatically depending on class, gender, age, and occupation, yet certain rhythms and patterns characterized the city's routine. Fashion reflected class distinctions while showing signs of evolution from Victorian and Edwardian styles, particularly for women. For wealthy and upper-middle-class households, mornings began with servants preparing breakfast, cleaning, and attending to household tasks. Family members rose at leisurely hours, with men reading newspapers over breakfast before departing for business or professional activities. Women of these classes managed households, supervised servants, made social calls, shopped in fashionable districts, and engaged in charitable work. Afternoon tea remained an important social ritual, with formal receiving hours when ladies visited friends. Evenings might involve dinner parties, theater, or other social engagements. Middle-class daily life revolved around work and domestic routines. Men typically left early for offices, shops, or other employment, commuting by underground, bus, or train. Workdays lasted 8 to 10 hours, with Saturday half-days common. Women managing households without servants performed housework themselves, a demanding routine of cleaning, washing, cooking, and shopping. Shopping remained daily or near-daily necessity, given limited refrigeration and fresh food requirements. Neighborhood shops provided groceries and other necessities, with tradesmen delivering bread, milk, and other staples. Working-class life involved long working hours and domestic struggle. Men in manual labor left early for factory, dock, or construction work, laboring 9 or 10 hours. Women who worked outside homes balanced employment with domestic responsibilities, a double burden that left little leisure time. Those in domestic service lived in employers' homes, with limited time off. Working-class wives and mothers faced exhausting routines of housework in difficult conditions, preparing meals on coal ranges, washing clothes laboriously without modern appliances, and managing households on limited budgets. Fashion for men had changed relatively little from Edwardian styles. Middle and upper-class men wore suits with jackets, waistcoats, and trousers in dark colors. Formal occasions required morning coats or evening dress. Hats were essential, with bowlers for business, top hats for formal occasions, and flat caps for working-class men. Collars were stiff and detachable, requiring regular laundering and fresh collars daily for those maintaining respectable appearances. Working-class men wore simpler clothing suitable for physical labor, though they owned Sunday-best outfits for church and social occasions. Women's fashion was experiencing revolutionary changes. The restrictive corseted silhouettes of the Edwardian era were giving way to simpler, more comfortable styles. Hemlines, which had touched the ground in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, were rising, reaching mid-calf by 1920. This rising hemline scandalized conservatives, but reflected women's changing roles and activities. Waistlines had dropped from the natural waist to lower positions, creating straighter silhouettes. Corsets remained common, but were becoming less restrictive than their Victorian predecessors. Middle and upper-class women's wardrobes included multiple outfits for different occasions and times of day: morning dresses for household activities, afternoon dresses for social calls and shopping, and evening dresses for formal occasions reflected elaborate codes governing appropriate dress. Hats remained essential for respectable women venturing outside, ranging from elaborate creations for wealthy women to simpler styles for working and middle classes. Gloves were standard accessories, with different lengths and materials for various occasions. Working-class women's clothing emphasized practicality and durability over fashion. Simple dresses or blouses and skirts in hard-wearing fabrics served for everyday wear, with better outfits reserved for Sundays and special occasions. Second-hand clothing markets and cheap ready-made garments made basic clothing accessible to working-class families, though quality was often poor. Hair and cosmetics reflected changing attitudes. Women's hairstyles were moving away from elaborate Victorian and Edwardian coiffures towards simpler styles, though the boyish bob haircuts associated with flappers were just emerging and remained controversial. Cosmetics use was increasing among younger women, particularly those from wealthier backgrounds, though heavy makeup remained associated with actresses and women of questionable reputation in conventional society's view. Children's daily lives centered on school and play. Middle-class children attended lessons, practiced music or other accomplishments, and played in gardens or parks under supervision. Working-class children attended school until age 14, then transitioned to employment. Street play was common in working-class neighborhoods, with children creating games in streets and alleys. Gender differences in activities emerged early, with boys expected to be more boisterous and physically active, while girls learned domestic skills alongside formal education. Meal patterns reflected class differences. Wealthy households maintained formal dining routines, with multiple courses served by staff. Middle-class families ate simpler but substantial meals, with dinner typically the main evening meal. Working-class diets emphasized filling, cheap foods, bread, potatoes, tea, and when affordable, meat. Malnutrition remained common among the poor, particularly children. Food adulteration and quality varied, though regulations had improved from Victorian scandals. Domestic technology was transitioning but unevenly distributed. Wealthy and middle-class homes increasingly had electric lighting, though gas remained common. Indoor plumbing and bathrooms were standard in better housing but absent in much working-class accommodation. Refrigeration was rare, with iceboxes or cool pantries serving food storage needs. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and other labor-saving appliances existed but remained luxury items beyond most households' means. Coal remained the primary heating fuel, with coal fires in individual rooms standard rather than central heating. Personal hygiene practices reflected available facilities. Wealthy households had bathrooms with running hot water, enabling regular bathing. Working-class families bathed in portable tubs filled with water heated on stoves, a laborious process making weekly baths typical rather than daily showers. Public bathhouses provided bathing facilities for those without home facilities. Transportation shaped daily experiences. The underground and bus networks enabled middle-class suburban living, with commutes becoming daily routines. Walking remained the primary transportation for many working-class people living near employment. Bicycle use was increasing, offering affordable personal transportation. Private motor cars remained rare, the privilege of wealthy households. Health and illness remained serious concerns. Medical care quality depended on ability to pay, with wealthy patients accessing doctors and specialists, while working-class people relied on charity hospitals, dispensaries, or went without treatment. Infectious diseases including tuberculosis, influenza, and childhood diseases remained serious threats, particularly in overcrowded working-class housing. Life expectancy varied dramatically by class, with poverty correlating with significantly shorter lives. Social divisions permeated daily interactions. Accent, dress, and behavior immediately signaled class status. Deference remained expected from lower to higher classes in social interactions. The wartime experiences and social changes were gradually eroding traditional hierarchies. Knowing one's place remained a social expectation, though increasingly resented by those expected to defer. Chapter 14. Healthcare and Public Health. Healthcare and public health in London 1920 reflected both significant progress since Victorian times and persistent problems, particularly inequalities based on class and geography. The city's health infrastructure combined voluntary hospitals, poor law infirmaries, public health services, and private medical practice in a complex patchwork. Major voluntary hospitals, including St. Thomas A.S., Guy's, St. Bartholomew Town, the London Hospital, and numerous others provided medical care primarily funded through charitable donations and patient payments. These institutions, often associated with medical schools, provided teaching hospitals where doctors trained and medical knowledge advanced. They treated acute illnesses and injuries, but generally refused chronic cases or patients unable to contribute to costs. Despite charitable missions, voluntary hospitals preferred respectable working class and lower middle class patients over the very poor. Poor law infirmaries, operated under the poor law system, theoretically provided medical care for destitute people unable to access voluntary hospitals or private care. These institutions carried stigma from their association with poverty and often provided lower quality care than voluntary hospitals. Conditions varied from adequate to grim, with chronic underfunding and association with workhouses making them unappealing options that people avoided when possible. Private medical practice served those who could afford fees. Harley Street and surrounding areas housed consulting rooms of fashionable physicians and specialists serving wealthy patients. General practitioners served middle-class families, providing both office consultations and home visits. Medical fees represented significant expenses for middle-class families, though affordable for those with regular incomes. Working-class people generally could not afford private doctors, relying instead on hospital outpatient departments, medical dispensaries, or going without treatment. The medical profession was hierarchical and gendered. Elite consultants and specialists, almost exclusively men from upper-middle-class backgrounds, enjoyed high status and substantial incomes. General practitioners occupied middle status, earning comfortable but modest incomes. Women doctors, though legally qualified to practice, faced discrimination and limited opportunities, typically relegated to treating women and children. Nurses, predominantly women, occupied subordinate positions, despite performing essential work, with low pay and harsh discipline characterizing nursing training and employment. Public health services, administered by the London County Council and metropolitan boroughs, focused on preventing disease and maintaining sanitary conditions. Medical officers of health in each borough supervised public health activities, including infectious disease control, sanitary inspections, food safety, and maternal and child health services. These preventive services had dramatically reduced mortality from infectious diseases compared to Victorian levels, though significant challenges remained. Infectious diseases continued claiming thousands of lives annually. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, remained a major killer, particularly among working-class populations living in overcrowded, poorly ventilated housing. The disease's association with poverty and poor living conditions made it particularly prevalent in East End and other working-class districts. Sanatorium treatment was developing, though facilities remained inadequate for the number of cases. The 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic had recently devastated London and the world, killing millions globally, including tens of thousands in Britain. The pandemic's recency in 1920 meant fresh grief and heightened awareness of epidemic disease threats. However, limited understanding of influenza's viral nature hampered prevention efforts. Childhood diseases including measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and diphtheria remained serious threats. Child mortality rates, though improved from Victorian levels, remained shockingly high by later standards, with infant mortality particularly elevated in poor districts. Malnutrition and inadequate housing contributed significantly to childhood disease susceptibility and mortality. Venereal diseases represented serious public health concerns, though social stigma and moral judgments complicated treatment and prevention efforts. Wartime experience had highlighted VD's prevalence, leading to somewhat more open discussion and treatment programs, though shame and stigma still prevented many from seeking help. Maternal mortality remained tragically high, with childbirth complications killing thousands of women annually. Midwifery standards varied dramatically, with trained midwives providing competent care, while untrained handywomen offered dangerous services. Hospital births were uncommon, with home births standard across classes. Though wealthier women could afford trained nurses and doctors' attendants, while working-class women often managed with minimal assistance. Mental health services remained primitive and stigmatizing. Mental hospitals, often called asylums, housed mentally ill people, and institutions emphasizing containment over treatment. Conditions varied from adequate to inhumane, with chronic overcrowding common. Mental illness carried severe stigma, and diagnosis could lead to permanent institutionalization with minimal legal protections.